Hi everyone, in this video I want to show you how to identify a limiting and excess reagent in a chemical reaction. So I have here my chemical reaction between calcium carbide and water to produce calcium hydroxide and carbon hydride. Now I was given 56.34 gram of calcium carbide and I want to react with 46.84 gram of water. Now, in order to figure out which one is my limiting and which one is my excess reagent, I have to do two calculations. And whenever you see me give you two pieces of information like this, you know that you have to have two different calculations. So that's just a clue of how many calculations you should have when you do your work. All right, let's start with the calculation. I want to do a calculation for each reactant and then use the smaller final answer to answer my question of which one is limiting and which one is excess reagent. I start with my first reactant, which is calcium carbide. Now this calculations answer the question. If I were to use up the entire 56.34 gram of calcium carbide, how much of this product, calcium hydroxide, would I get at the end? In order for you to get from gram of calcium carbide to gram of calcium hydroxide, we're going to do some stoichiometry, converting from gram to mole, and then from mole of one reagent to mole of the other reagent, which is calcium hydroxide. Then you can convert that back to gram by using the molar mass, giving me this much amount of calcium hydroxide produced. Now, this number tells me that if I used up the entire mass of calcium carbide that was given to me, I would get this much amount of calcium hydroxide produced at the end. My next calculation is that if I were to use up the entire mass of water that was given to me, which is 46.84 gram water, how much gram of the product would I get at the end? I'm doing more stoichiometry using the same steps as before, giving me this number. Notice now that if I were to use up the entirety of our first reactant, which is calcium carbide, I get a smaller amount of product at the end, versus if I were to use up the entirety of water, I would get a bigger number of product at the end. And by definition, our limiting reactant limits the amount of product that is produced at the end of a reaction. So, choosing this calculation, you can determine that calcium carbide is our limiting reactant because it makes less product. Then if one is limiting, the other reactant must be excess. So water here is our excess reactant because it makes more product at the end. Let's take a look at another example of how you would do this same process where you identify the limiting and the excess reagent or reactant in each of these following reactions. So here's my first reaction. Silver combined with hydrogen sulfide, giving me silver sulfide and hydrogen gas. If I were to be given 42.5 gram of silver to react with 46.1 gram of hydrogen sulfide, which one is my limiting and which one is my excess reagent? Once again, we're doing two calculations for each of these pieces of information that was given to me. First, I start with silver. If I were to use up the entirety of the 42.5 gram of silver, how much of the product silver sulfide would I get at the end? And I'm following the same process where I convert gram of silver to mole of silver, then using the mole ratio between silver and silver sulfide to get to this point, and then converting that back to gram of silver sulfide, giving me the final answer. Moving on to our next calculation, we have 46.1 gram of hydrogen sulfide. How much of silver sulfide would I get at the very end? And I'm doing the same stoichiometric process, giving me this number. Now, as you can see, if I were to use up all of the silver that was given to me, I could make 48.8 gram of silver sulfide. If I were to use up all of the hydrogen sulfide that was given to me, I could make 335 grams of silver sulfide, which is way more than this number here. So silver must be our limiting reactant because it produces less of the product. So here's a limiting reactant, and if one is limiting, the other one must be excess. So here's our excess reactant, hydrogen sulfide.